The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Not All Days Are Created Equal opens an insightful new book that examines seminal moments that have shaped modern Canada by Aaron Hughes. Some days are singularly momentous to a nation's formation and outlook. The true significance of them only becomes apparent after the fact. Hughes starts by pointing to the October 13, 1970 declaration from then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, "Just watch me," as a crystallizing moment. 3 days later, he implemented the War Measures Act, which curtailed civil liberties across the country. And on a completely different and less ominous note, April 17th, 1972 is a day that made Canadians' sense of self as a nation swell. That's when Paul Henderson scored his famous goal in the dying seconds of the Russia-Canada Hockey Summit Series, a goal that united the country. I invited Aaron Hughes, the author of 10 Days That Shaped Modern Canada, to join me for a conversation that matters about why we need to understand what we are as a country, how we became who we are, and the connection between now and then. Aaron, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Stuart.
Pretty hard to pick 10 days. How did you go about picking 10 days? Because, answer the question. I'll let you answer that question. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and I mean, some were so obvious. The Pierre Trudeau's "Just Watch Me." I also chose dates like the Tragically Hip's final concert, which I thought would be fairly obvious. I mean, there were other things that I could have chosen that I didn't choose, such as I always thought the beginnings of Terry Fox's Marathon of Hope. I even thought of thinking, maybe the day that Tim Hortons ceased to be a Canadian company. But I think that I ended up choosing days that I did because I think that they really, for any Canadian of a particular age, would know, would at least be familiar with them. And I even challenge readers in the introduction to, my goal is that this will create a national conversation so that people will say, well, yeah, that's an interesting day, but what about day X or day Y or day Z? So again, the idea is that these are my dates. I think a lot of people would probably understand why I chose them. I'd like to think that people might argue with me and maybe even argue amongst themselves about what dates they consider to be formative to our modern nation state of Canada.
You know, I think that it's interesting that you point out Pierre Trudeau, because I remember when he was Prime Minister, he was asked, what's the Canadian national identity? And he didn't really have an answer for it. And nobody has really come up with one since. By examining these important dates, is this going to help us to have a greater understanding of who we are as a nation?
I think so. And, it's funny you should say that because Pierre Trudeau is really, at least for the early chapters, is at the center of so many of them. There's one chapter on the patriation of the Constitution. So I agree that Trudeau didn't have an idea of what Canadian identity would be, but I think he would say that that's that's the beauty of a Canadian identity. I remember once he said, in response to the idea of an all-American boy or an all-American girl, he said that there could never be an all-Canadian boy or an all-Canadian girl because that would be too exclusive, and that everyone and that such exclusivity can ultimately lead to problems, as perhaps as we see in this country. So I think that these dates, I fell in love with them. I think to me, the date wasn't important just because of the date, but often more important was what happened because of what happened on those dates. So I really do think, I would encourage Canadians to read the book, to think about it. Maybe to go back to Pierre Trudeau again for a second, is he once said, as probably most of your viewers know, that living next to the United States is sleeping with an elephant. And no matter how good humored the beast, you feel every twitch. And I think that's true. So much of my identity growing up in Edmonton, we got Canadian, we still do Canadian, American TV channels, American radio stations, American popular culture. So I think that for us as a nation, to grow, to think about where we were, who we are, and what we want to become, we really need to focus on us and who we are. And again, I think this book is a first step in an attempt to do that.
Well, I found it interesting that you picked that date. Just watch me. His response to what was happening in Quebec is the tide of separation was really rising. It led to the FLQ crisis in Montreal and Quebec, the kidnapping of Pierre Lapointe, right?
Laporte, yeah.
Laporte, sorry, thank you. It's funny how. And so many years later, some of the fine details start to move away. But that really led towards the referendum many years later. Like, we were moving in a direction that looked like it was tearing Canada apart. And there were so many companies, organizations, and individuals that left Quebec because they were worried that they were going to be left outside of Canada. I think that it really is a truly important date in modern Canada.
Yeah, I agree, Stuart. And I think the reverberations of that date reappear in several other ones. Chapter 5, if I recall it, Chapter 5 is the referendum on October 30th of 1993, I believe it was. No, 1995. And there was the FLQ crisis, the invocation of the War Measures Act. Then about a decade later, we have the patriation of the Constitution from the United Kingdom and the enactment of a Constitutional Bill of Rights, i.e. the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And even on the day when I still remember as a kid in Edmonton watching the Trudeau and the Queen and Jean Chrétien with their ceremony, pouring rain, and I think it was René Lévesque that day ordered that all Quebec flags be flown at half-mast. So again, we see these tensions, and things like the Meech Lake Accord, the Charlottetown Accord, all these things only make sense if we keep in mind that original date of the patriation and maybe going back to the tensions between the FLQ. So, yeah, I really love writing the book because all of these things became intertwined, and I do think the book's written from maybe a particular perspective, which is sort of Anglophone, but I did try to give voice to those who might feel excluded. I mean, even just the patriation of the Constitution in 1982. We have to realize that Indigenous voices were completely left off. And what we call universal human rights that are found in the Charter, Indigenous populations in Canada might say those are not universal human rights. Those are those are universal human rights that the colonial or the West has constructed. I also tried to pay attention to, again, these things like the Parti Québécois, the Bloc Québécois on the Quebec side of things, and then also the rise of the Reform Party. If we remember them, for a long time they were the official opposition, but now they are, well, I guess, part of the Conservative Party now. So yeah, so it's just, I think Canadian. I wasn't trained as a Canadian historian. I was trained as an Islamic historian, and I just have always loved Canadian history, and I'm proud of Canadian history. I'm proud to be Canadian, and I really think these are stories that people need to know, not just historically, but also every single date that's in there influences us. So anytime you pick up a paper, you should be able to, based on any headline, should be able to go back to one of these these formative days.
I got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Well, you referenced Indigenous people in Canada. How important was the release, and I know that it's one of the dates that you have in there, the release of the Truth and Reconciliation's executive summary about the findings of that very, very painful commission that traveled across the country and collected the stories and history of Indigenous Canadians who were particularly a part of the residential school system?
Yeah, no, it's very painful, and I think that even of the 10 days, I try to make the argument that not all the 10 days are the same. So we can point to some days like December 6th, 1989, when we had the massacre at the École Polytechnique in Montreal. We know what happened, and then we know what happened because of it, in terms of gun control and those kinds of things. And then there's other dates, like the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the executive summary. And I tried to make the point there that we don't know what's going to happen because of that date. I mean, we can either say, we can acknowledge it and say, yeah, this happened, and then we can move on as if just sort of sweep it under the carpet. Or I think if we're going to be true to ourselves as Canadians, no matter where, new Canadians, old Canadians, whatever we want to call ourselves, we really have to wrestle with the residential school system and with our I think really poor treatment of our Indigenous populations. I mean, there's another date that I also say could be symbolic, but hopefully will be more than that. And the final chapter is the date on which the new $10 bill with Viola Desmond was released. And again, that's an attempt to. I love the note, with it just sort of in long, and on the one hand we have her picture on the front, in addition to parts of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have to decide what are we going to do because of that. I mean, it's not clear. So these dates, the future of some of these dates still has to be written, and I hope we'll write them positively, and it won't just be symbolic.
Well, going back to the release of the executive summary on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think that if we take a look at the way that attitudes are changing, since then in conjunction with that, we had the Supreme Court decision known as Silcotin, which established a standard of ownership for First Nations that didn't exist before. Since then, the federal government and the provincial government in British Columbia have introduced the principles of UNDRIP, something that some people say we don't need because we already had Bill 35. But what I see happening as a result of this is that there's this move to say we're not going to have two separate societies in Canada, and maybe that fits into also, you point out that the introduction of the Multiculturalism Act was fundamentally important to the nature of Canada.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I guess I should maybe almost preface the whole book, or maybe I should have prefaced the whole interview by saying, I love Canada, and I believe in Canada. Canada's not perfect, far from it, but I've lived in many countries over the past 50 years, and I damn well can't think of a better experiment than the Canadian experiment, with its ability to include people. Does that mean all Canadians are inclusive? No, of course not. We've seen this recently with various protests, but I think that there is an awareness that before, again, it was always a platitude. It was lip service. There's three founding peoples in Canada: French, English, and Indigenous. Of course, the Indigenous were always left out of those conversations. I think increasingly now they're being brought in, and I think it's so important. I mean, it's, to me, it's so, our treatment of Indigenous populations is very upsetting to me, as I think it should be to most white or non-Indigenous Canadians. So I mean, I don't think that the book isn't certainly going to bring them in the conversation, but I do think that one can't tell the story of modern Canada without including those whom have traditionally been excluded, i.e. the Indigenous. Just like we can't tell it without taking into consideration voices of alienation in Quebec, which are very, very valid voices of alienation. We can't tell the story of modern Canada without talking about the voices of alienation in the West, which are also very valid voices. So how does one create this sort of inclusive Canada? And I think we can do it, but I think we have to have people that believe in the Canadian experiment. And I think if anything, the chapter on multiculturalism, the chapter on the Charter, the chapter on Viola Desmond, all of these try to show what a great and inclusive country we can become if we continue on this path and not enter down the paths of identity politics and exclusionary, being exclusive of others.
This is our second break. We'll be right back. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Well, to that point about inclusion, you talk about Egan versus Canada, the battle for same-sex access to spousal pension benefits under the Old Age Security Act. Even though that they lost, it did pave the way to same-sex marriages. And what does that say about how these days that you have pointed out influence change that may take time to unfold, but it ignites the process?
Exactly. And I think even Egan v. Canada on May 25th, 1995 only makes sense in light of the patriation of the Constitution and the enactment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as a constitutional Bill of Rights as opposed to a non-constitutional Bill of Rights, which we had before that. And I mean, given the Charter and its protection of human freedoms, when the Egan v. Canada came before the Supreme Court, even though the court ruled against them, every single one of the 9 judges agreed that sexual orientation had to be a protected ground. And because of that, I mean, within 2 years or within 3 years, we have same-sex marriage. The same thing you can talk about. I'm not going to talk about abortion and Henry Morgentaler, but again, prior to the enactment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, he could be hauled before the courts. Afterwards, no, because a woman's right to the protections are a protected ground in the Constitution. So again, all these dates, then they're not random dates. They may appear random when the reader first picks them up and looks at them, but ultimately they're all interconnected, and they all tell the story of modern Canada. So the dates, so many of them interact or intersect with one another.
So I know you point out August 20th, 2016, the day that Tragically Hip's last concert was played. Why is that so important?
Well, for me, that was important because the Hip was always, I mean, they're Canada's band. I mean, certainly we have a lot of other, famous Canadian bands. In fact, I was just in London a few weeks ago, and I saw Geddy Lee in the Maple Leaf Lounge in London, and I was thinking, so I mean, a great. But you look at people like Rush, or you look at people like maybe Neil Young. Their lyrics don't speak. They're not Canadian lyrics. So Rush is a band that's from Canada, whereas I would say the Tragically Hip is a Canadian band. And I think Canadians loved them all the more for it because they didn't have quite the same success in America as they did in Canada. And then I tried to use that as a way to think about, it was funny, 3 weeks after the Tragically Hip's final concert, Donald Trump received the Republican nomination in Cleveland. And then we all know what happened because of that. And relations between Canada and America became frayed somewhat during the Trump years. And the Hip became this magnet that Canadians could think about. So again, even though the chapter is about the Hip and their final concert and what a great band they were and what a great wordsmith Gord Downey was, it's also a way to reflect on Canada's place vis-a-vis America. So the chapter kind of works through from the Tragically Hip to I give a number of statistics based on our Canadians' mistrust of America during the Trump years, and also a way to think about the closing of the border that would happen because of COVID-19 restrictions.
Okay, from a personal interest, I'm a bit of a Nickelback fan, and I'm hoping that what you're saying will elevate our estimation of Nickelback, because they're a good group of guys from Hanna, Alberta, not too far from where you hail from. Do we need, and maybe this is what you're saying, we need to be able to embrace, a sense of pride about what we do in Canada, and especially if we've had success, let's celebrate it, not pull it down.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I live in the United States now. I wrote this book when I was a visiting professor at the University of Oxford. In between, and for me, Canada has always been this beacon. It's this country that has shaped me. It's made me into the person I am, a human rights advocate and an advocate for Indigenous rights. And I think that Canada is wonderful. And I know it might not be politically correct to say this in this day and age. I don't think it's a perfect country. I think but I know of no better national experiment than the Canadian one. And I think we have to believe in it. And I think we have to, more importantly, I think we have to make it better. We can't just rest on our laurels. And sometimes that's very easy because as I say in the chapter on Viola Desmond, we can always look down at America and say, oh, look at their problems. And then because we have so many problems in America, we ignore our own problems. And I don't think that's a productive way to go. I think we constantly, I think Canada as the Canadian government, and I think every Canadian, no matter where you come from or where they came from, where we come from, we have to work on a daily basis to try to make Canada a better country for everybody.
Third and final break. We'll be back in a moment. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Okay, let's switch to hockey. Okay, in your book, interestingly enough, there's two elements in here that are related to hockey players. One is Tim Horton and his legacy, Tim Hortons Coffee. And then there's Paul Henderson, one of the highlights in hockey, but not so. I guess the thing that I find so interesting about this is, has hockey's place in Canada changed a little bit in the same way that we lost Tim Hortons to American ownership? We don't have a Paul Henderson moment happening in Canada these days. We don't win the Stanley Cup anymore.
No, I know. And I tell you, every time I watch Connor McDavid play, I mean, he's magical. And as I watch the Oilers once again, although they came further than they have in a long time, but yeah, it's hard, and I'm not even sure. So, I mean, certainly I think the Canadian teams have been eclipsed by American teams in recent years. I think that there's still American teams are really staffed or by Canadian players, but I'm not quite sure. I mentioned I make something with the Don Cherry's remarks in the when he talked about you people when you come over here and don't spend a toonie on a poppy. I thought that was a way that hockey is traditionally a very white sport, white players, white audiences. I think that we've now been there's now broadcasts in Punjabi, I think in Vancouver, that are broadcast nationally, and I'm not sure if we were have a Summit Series now, if it would have quite the same cachet. Obviously, we don't have the Cold War anymore. I think that I tried to show how the Cold War really figured into that series. Maybe the Tragically Hip was that moment where maybe the Tragically Canadians came together for the Tragically Hip's final concert in ways that they did for the Summit Series. And also when the Summit Series was played, this was before things like the Multiculturalism Act, Canada was a much whiter place. And I think that hockey, even though it's still Canada's sport, it's not hasn't been eclipsed by, but there's other sports. I mean, the Toronto Raptors won the NBA finals. Whenever I think this is a World Cup year coming. Canada has a hell of a soccer team this year, unprecedented. So I think as the demographics have changed in Canada, I'm not sure we could have a Summit Series or have that kind of viewership, but I don't know.
To wrap up, I like your assertion that the Canadian experiment is a fantastic one. I remember being at a presentation that former U.S. President Bill Clinton gave here in Vancouver shortly after his presidency, and he said, I love Vancouver. And he said, whether you know it or not, people around the world are looking at harmonious living as manifested in Vancouver and Canada as a whole. And I think that, to your point, that's what we're about, harmonious living.
I think so, and respecting the rights of others, and not wanting to make them be like us, but allowing them to be themselves. And I've had that same conversation, Stuart, with people from New Zealand, people from Norway, people from Poland, and they all say, Canada is the place in terms of dealing with immigration, with migration, and trying to build a society from all of those people. I mean, even as President Barack Obama said, I mean, the world needs more Canada, and I think it does. And I think Canadians should be proud of that. But again, not to rest on the laurels, but to work on a daily basis to make Canada into a better place, better even than it is now.
Well, the aim of your book is to ignite conversations that will help us to build upon what we have so far. Thank you for sharing it with us and for your time today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity, sir. I really appreciate it.